You've heard it said that storytelling is everything. But what if everything is storytelling? What if every action we take, every word we speak, every thought we think is a story? If so, then we all need to be better storytellers because the story we tell will determine the impact we make in our lives, in our work, and in our dreams. I'm Jonathan Jordan, your storytelling coach, and this is Everything is Storytelling, a podcast for people obsessed with story. Have you ever had the problem of not knowing what stories to share with the world about what you do? Well, what if I told you the solution to that problem is actually finding another problem? A couple weeks ago, I shared about how there are 5 story types, and we talked about personal anecdotes. So if you missed that episode, guess what? You can pull it up there in your favorite podcast app, and you can listen to it later or right now, whatever floats your boat. But today, we're going to be diving into the second story type, which are problem solution stories. Okay. So this has come up multiple times in my career as a book coach and ghostwriter, but sometimes I'll sit down with a client. And a lot of times these are the clients who claim to not be natural storytellers. And they'll even say, I don't really know what story to tell you about this situation. Especially whenever I start kind of poking and prodding a little bit and say, okay, great idea, but how can we show this to the reader through a story? And they'll sit there, they'll think about it. And, there's a little bit of frustration that they can't think of a story. So whenever that happens, what I do is I like to take a couple steps back and I say, you know what? Before we think about any kind of stories, how about we just talk about the problems that you solve for people? And so a lot of times I'll even tell them, hey, just tell me the 5 most common problems that you encounter. And every time that I ask a client this, something amazing happens. As soon as I ask them what problems they solve, they're able to start rattling them off one after another. And then all of a sudden, they have stories to go along with them. And then we're able to build their book content. I'm telling you, it works. It works every time. It's miraculous. So when we're thinking about problem solution stories, in a lot of ways, you could say that most stories are problem solution stories, not just in nonfiction, but even in fiction. So I'm going to give you 2 examples from 2 very famous but very different books. So let's take The Lord of the Rings first. The problem there sounds something like this. Hey guys, this ring, it is legit evil. What's the solution to the problem? Yo, let's go drop it into this evil volcano. There you go. Problem solution story. Second example, Pride and Prejudice. The problem there sounds something like this. I don't like that guy. Solution? Let's get married. Okay, I know I'm being just a tiny little bit facetious here, but I think you get the point. Most of the stories that stick with us move characters from a problem to a solution. And it's really no different in nonfiction because in nonfiction, your reader is actually the hero of the story. And you are moving them as their guide. You're moving them from the problem that they have to the solution that you have for them. Okay. That way you can take them from point A to point Z. So in nonfiction storytelling, that's really where we want to focus our energy today. So I love you, fiction people. I really do. But we're going to focus more on nonfiction today. So problem solution stories provide a incredibly practical framework for you. If you know what your target reader's underlying problem is, then problem solution stories, they don't just build rapport with the reader, they actually allow you to show your expertise without having to say, hey, I'm an expert, I can solve your problem. You're able to actually give them an example of what that looks like. Okay. And here's the great thing, they don't have to be huge problem solutions either. Like, you don't have to save the world in the example. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's actually better if the examples you use are simply relatable. So I'll give you an example from my own career. When I was starting a new ghostwriting gig for a publisher back in 2020, I realized that I was going to need to take really great notes as I met with clients. Even though the calls would be recorded, here's the thing, you don't want to over rely on the recording in case of a tech glitch. Had that happen before. Looking at you, Zoom. And so on my first few projects with the publisher, I took notes by hand in a notebook. And I know that sounds crazy, okay? But handwriting notes was the first idea that popped in my head because, of course, that was just the standard practice growing up. Taking notes in class, taking notes in church, taking notes for my own story ideas. Like, I didn't grow up taking a laptop with me to class. That didn't happen until I was in college. And even in college, I only did that in maybe one or two classes. Okay. So, I mean, I know for people who are younger than me, this is sounding like the wild, wild west or something, but that's just how the world was. And whenever I would take notes by hand starting this gig, I encountered several problems because of how archaic the method was. First, I couldn't write as fast as my client could speak. So I was just scribbling keywords completely out of context. And then later on, I'd have to look those keywords back up in the transcript to try to figure out what exactly the point was that they were making. So it was a very slow, tedious process of putting the content back together. And then another problem was that sometimes it looked like I wasn't paying attention to the call because my eyes were constantly directed down at the page instead of looking at my client's face. So you can see how that would get annoying, or they might think I was distracted and they would pause and I would say, no, no, I'm listening. I'm just writing this down. Right. So that was problematic. And then a few times I left my notebook at home, and then I'd be having my call with the client at work during my lunch break, because this was back when I was still working at 9 to 5, or I'd be doing it in a coffee shop while my son was at gymnastics practice. And so then I'm just kind of scrambling to take notes in some other way. So that was a problem. And then uh, my family can vouch for this. My handwriting is terrible. It has not progressed much beyond the third grade. Okay. And even I have struggled at times to decipher my own scribbles, which is a little embarrassing to admit. This is why sometimes I tell people that you only need one person to have communication problems. I prove that all the time with myself, trying to figure out what it was that I wrote down. So, yeah, that's a problem. And then I guess a last problem would be I would get hand cramps. And when you get hand cramps, it's hard to keep up with the notes. And then it's hard to actually type later on. So, yeah, all these problems because I was trying to take notes by hand. And so, one of those days when I accidentally left my notebook behind at home, suddenly the solution to my problem slapped me right in the face. The answer was so easy. It was so obvious. All I needed to do was open a document on my word processor, title it call notes, and then I could just type while they were talking. And very, very easily, I could search the keywords that I needed without having to flip through pages and decipher my chicken scratch writing. Okay. Again, I should have thought of that in the first place, but it took all this other stuff for me to realize it. So yeah, that one easy change provided multiple solutions to my problems. I could keep my eyes on the client during the call more often. I type way faster than what I can handwrite because I can save the document on the cloud. There's no leaving it behind. I can pull it up whenever I need to. And again, I'm not having to translate my handwriting, which is maybe the biggest win here. So this was such a ridiculously easy solution once I was finally forced into it. And I think at minimum, I've probably doubled my output because I'm no longer creating more work for myself by having to decipher my handwriting, having to reassemble the notes and figure out what the client was trying to say. This new method freed me from having to retype my notes. So yeah, it really was a game changer for me as far as ghostwriting goes. Now, for a long time, I was embarrassed to tell anyone about this problem and solution. I kind of assumed that I'm the only idiot ghostwriter who used notebooks instead of just using a digital file there on my computer. But then when I did finally share my process with others, I was amazed how often it actually came up in conversations with other ghostwriters and book editors who would say, "Oh, you know what? I've had that same problem. I've always taken my notes by hand. Why am I not doing it in a word processor?" So, yeah, it turned out that it was actually a very relatable and common problem among other professional writers and book editors. So, yeah, I should have just been bold enough to admit the problem sooner, and maybe I could have helped people sooner by admitting the process I'd had to go through. And so this actually overlaps really well with another issue that I see with aspiring authors, especially in the nonfiction space. Sometimes they are worried when they're writing their books that they're going to give away too much information. They're going to give away too much of their knowledge in the book. They're afraid that essentially they're going to give away so much that the person reading a book isn't going to need to hire them, which is the whole reason they're writing the book a lot of times. Not always, but a lot of times. So yeah, so this fear leads them in their book to only talk about the problems and then offer up no solutions. They're not giving any kind of proof that they can actually help solve the problem. And here's the thing, if you're going to build trust with readers and if you're going to gain them as clients, if that's the end goal of your book, then you better offer up those solutions too. They're going to want to see them because here's what you need to face. Solutions often need to be tailored to the individual with the problem. Okay. So you may be able to generally give them some advice, and some people will figure out how to mold it to their specific problem. But your target reader who's going to hire you, they're likely the type of person who wants that additional assistance when tailoring a solution to their problem. They've probably already tried a bunch of stuff on their own that didn't work. And that's why they're turning to your book in the first place. Okay. So, really, you've got nothing to lose by sharing problem solution stories. All right, so I want you to consider some of the following problem solution story prompts. Okay, here's the first one. One time, I had a client who came to me with problem X. Here's what we did for them. And so you just spell out the process at that point. Second one, have you ever had X happen to you? Well, when it happened to client Z, we boom, boom, boom. Spell out the process. Third one, one day I received the email I had hoped I'd never get. Here's what we did next. Okay, so you can see a pattern forming here. The formula for problem solution stories, it's honestly painfully easy to follow. First, introduce the problem. That's what we did in all those prompts that I just read off. And then step 2, if necessary, explain why the problem is a problem. This may be necessary if the service that you provide solves a problem that people don't even realize they have. Okay, so this does add an extra step in the process, but sometimes you need to do it. Step 3, explain any steps taken to address the problem. So this could also include any steps that didn't work, because that will show your perseverance and your willingness to iterate the process and figure things out for the client. Okay. Step 4, present the solution. And you need to do that through a story, just in case that's not already really obvious. And then finally, step 5, you need to show the outcome. So provide some kind of explanation of how the solution made life better for the problem haver. Okay, so you want to show that you took them again from point A to point Z. So I actually had a client one time who followed that exact formula in pretty much every chapter of her book. In fact, she actually supercharged this concept by showing 3 different versions of each problem and then 3 different solutions. So that way, readers had several opportunities within a chapter to see themselves in the story, which I thought was really brilliant of her to do. And that solidified her as an expert without her actually having to say, hey, I'm an expert. Okay. She showed with clear examples of how she helped people solve these different common problems. And now her book is helping her not only share that insight, but it's also helping her gain high paying clients who are facing those similar problems. Okay. So huge win for her. Now, I need to leave you with an important caveat here, which is that problem solution stories work best when they come from firsthand experience. There are times when you can borrow a problem solution story from someone else, but you do need to make sure that you're going to give that person credit for it and show how you applied their method for yourself. Okay. Otherwise, you're not developing the necessary credibility with the reader. So it is okay to borrow that experience, but you need to probably at least use it in a way where you can say, hey, I tried this and here's how it went. Okay. So if you don't have firsthand experience to share, that's okay, because what that's going to do is actually lead us into our next story type, which I'm going to cover in a future episode, which are called case studies. Okay. Case studies can be firsthand, but you can also use external case studies whenever you don't have that firsthand experience. But again, we'll get into that in a future episode. Okay. So if you want to learn more about leveraging problem solution stories, then you should definitely go pre-order my new book, Start with Story, which is releasing on October 29th. And since I myself set the price for the book, let me promise you something. It will never be as cheap again as it is right now. So go grab a copy now before the price goes up later, because I promise you, it will go up. And if you haven't done so yet, please take a second to leave the show a 5-star rating and a review so that you can help out other story-obsessed people find the show, and so they can start sharing more problem solution stories with the world. Okay. That way we can spread the storytelling movement and change the world one story at a time.